I wish we were in a different place, but I think the companies that are really committed to DEI are doing it. There's a lot of people that are throwing things out there, and they can go to their board or they can feel good at night that, hey, we checked that box or we're doing that. But you also remember right after George Floyd, DEI, I think it was the hottest career. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
every job listing. And look now, it's not there.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, and this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or at goodmorninghr.com. Joining me today for our monthly roundup of HR news is my friend Terri Swain. Terri is the founder and chief truth seeker at Decipher, an HR consulting firm specializing in equal employment opportunity investigations, employee relations, and interim HR leadership. Terri has 25 years experience as an HR consultant, and prior to that, she was a corporate HR leader and an investigator for the EEOC. But her most notable accomplishment is that she was my second guest on this podcast way back in 2021. Welcome back to Good Morning HR, Terri.
Thank you.
So this is where we talk about news from the month of May. And this episode is dropping on May 25th, which is the third anniversary of George Floyd's murder, which sparked our whole COVID summer of Black Lives Matter protests around the country. And in the wake of all that, a lot of corporations began appointing DEI leaders to ostensibly embrace diversity and ensure that equity, inclusion, and belonging were available to all of their employees. So you've spent much of your career focused on EEO issues. How have things changed from your experience in the last 3 years?
Well, I'd like to say that a lot, but I'm going to say not much. I think that, like a lot of things, there's been reaction. A lot of corporations have been reactive. Board of directors, senior leaders, like, we have to go get some DEI. We've got to do some training. We got to throw some resources at this. It's very high visibility. But anybody who's been in this for a long time, like I have, knows it is a super long game. I mean, it is holistic. People who have done it well, I look at the AT&Ts, Pepsi, Frito, they started way long time ago, and they've been chipping away, not always getting everything right, but looking at it as a long-term strategy. So I think a lot of people went in for the short term, and you see the flops. And I think employee complaints are on the rise. The one thing I can think that's been positive is that I think there's more sensitivity, perhaps, but I've also seen a lot of people just really expressing things outwardly, negatively relative to race, sexual orientation, that I haven't heard people say before either. So it's kind of this mixed bag. How about you? What's been your experience or observation?
Well, I think most of what we saw starting in summer 2020 from the corporate side was performative. Okay, we got to do something. And I think, and this is not necessarily going to be popular, but screw it, it's my podcast, is that a bunch of maybe well-meaning people, but I think a lot of them, or a handful of them, some of them, I don't know, are hucksters out there putting themselves out as DEI consultants and, playing on this corporate desire to do something and to be seen as doing something. And so I think a lot of what I've seen in these DEI programs that have sprung up over the last few years, again, it's performative, but they're just reintroducing a whole different set of broad generalizations that we would call stereotypes. And so they talk about white people, they talk about Black people's experiences, they talk about these different, gay people's experiences as though they're monolithic. And it takes us right back to stereotypes because, nobody's experiences are the same. And when we start talking about people in these broad categories, and we also, too often, these conversations turn into the oppressor and the oppressed, or the villain and the victimized. I don't think, I think the studies out there in the last few years show that you don't change hearts and minds through re-education or through these kind of training programs where you make people realize their privilege. Yeah, we've got different people have different kinds of privilege. We've got different backgrounds there, and no one phenotypic trait that you happen to have is going to define who you are and what your privilege was and what your experiences were. And I think we've had too much of that. If we really want to, and I think this is what you're talking about, AT&T, Frito-Lay, some of the big guys who've been working on it for a long time. If you really want to mitigate bias in the workplace, it starts with systems. We're not going to eliminate people's biases. We all have biases. They're hard learned. They're hardwired in our systems by the time, we become adults. And maybe we can help people recognize them. But when you put a gun to somebody's head, make them sit in a conference room all day, and somebody tells you what your biases are, and if you deny those biases, there's something wrong with you. That doesn't help morale.
And honestly, training is the last thing you should always do if you're looking at a DEI strategy. Because if you look at the Fritos, Pepsis, AT&T, just a few that I'm familiar with, they start with the business case. Hey, we want market share,
exactly.
Right? If we want market share, we have to have representation. We have to have representation in the images we show on TV. We have to have representation within our organization. We have to have representation in our supplier diversity. So we take this holistic look and we start putting those systems and processes in place that become diverse, that springboard off of, maybe our affirmative action plan, or springboard off of some of those things. And then when we have all the systems in place, we start chipping away at it. Because you're right. I mean, I have found myself actually in the last few years coming to terms with some things, that deeply held things that I had just from conversations that have, come out of these movements. But if you sat me down in a corporate environment and told me this is how it is, or this is what you're experiencing, whatever, I probably wasn't going to take it as much as when I was open to receiving and hearing. And I also want to go back to your point about the hucksters. There's so many DEI consultants. There's so many people out there that claim to be it. But on the flip side of that, I know a lot of super talented DEI people, super talented, that are up against organizations not listening to them about this long game. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but really I just want some training right now because my board, blah, blah, blah,
right.
blah. And then what happens is, even if they suggest some training, they're editing it, right? So yeah, I mean, I wish we were in a different place, but I think the companies that are really committed to DEI are doing it. There's a lot of people that are throwing things out there, and they can go to their board, or they can feel good at night that, hey, we checked that box, or we're doing that. But you also remember right after George Floyd, DEI, I think it was the hottest career. I mean, every job listing. And look, now it's not there.
Yeah, and now they're getting, they're especially in the tech world, as we do layoffs, those are the first positions getting cut. And I think it's because, well, first of all, some of those, some companies just weren't really dedicated to it. They just needed, they needed to throw some money at something to be performative, which is dumb. But beyond that, I don't think they were seeing an ROI on it, and especially startups and venture capital backed firms are very short term focused financially, and they're not willing to make that investment. But I've got a webinar that I recorded last fall, and that I've done several times at conferences. It's one of my most popular ones now, and it's on mitigating bias in the selection process. And it's all about systems, right? Okay, what's our process for defining what a job description contains, and are these really relevant to the position, or are these preferences? Anytime I see nice to have, it's a red flag for me when I'm looking at somebody's job descriptions. How are we writing our job postings so that we aren't, inadvertently or intentionally signaling to some group that this isn't the right job for you? Where are we posting those? Where are we advertising our jobs? What's our, if you want to you want to really improve DEI in your organization, train your managers on how to do good interviews. And, because they're going in shooting from the hip way too often. And so they walk away without any solid information about this person's competency. They just know I like this person or not. And so all of those things introduce bias. And then once they're employees, let's train a manager how to actually lead people and have conversations and recognize what's job related and what's just, well, that's unusual in our organization, but it's not a thing that I'm going to have to worry about. Those kind of things. And those are all system issues. And I don't think most of those are put in place to bring about inequality in the organization or to make people feel excluded. It's just the way they are. And if we don't take systemic approaches to fixing them, they're going to stay there.
Yeah. And even a step back from that in your leadership, top leadership, understanding your own biases.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, to me, is job one. I remember working in my corporate life, and we were in DEI back in the 90s. And we had a top consultant in the country come in, do focus groups. And the biggest thing that came out of that was work-life balance. And I remember our senior leader saying, we're not doing work-life balance. By the way, that was the railroad. It runs 365, 24/7, and it wasn't the culture. And they weren't willing, even though that's what they were hearing, they weren't willing to overcome that bias that we can't reshape the workplace at that point in time for work-life balance. Even if it meant like, we want to get more women into our organization and this is the way you're going to do it, they weren't willing. That it was a bias that they couldn't overcome. So there was no reason for us to plow ahead with everything. So I think even sometimes just understanding that's your bias, like and it wasn't going to work in our organization if we were going to try and do all these things to promote women, but we weren't going to give them work-life balance. It didn't matter if we recruited them. It didn't matter if we promoted them. It didn't matter if we paid them, we stole them from somebody else. It wasn't going to work.
And again, that bias, to really recognize that, takes somebody with a willingness to self-examine and to be contemplative about their own world. Because the bottom line is, I think we could just start our DEI training with just the affirmation that, what, we're all assholes. We all have preferences that
I'm not.
Oh, you're not, of course not. But we all have preferences that don't serve us well or don't serve the organization well. And let's just admit that. And we all do. It's not just because you're an over 40 white male that you've got. I mean, we all do. And we let those things, we've got those experiences in our past. And maybe somebody from this group treated me horribly at some point, or I had a horrible experience with somebody in this group, or I really had a great experience with somebody in this group. So what? That this next individual you're dealing with is not that person. And just because they have the same cultural background or racial background or whatever, education, whatever, doesn't mean that this person's, as soon as we realize that, and we don't want to be judged by the other a-holes, we just want to be judged on our own a-holeness. I think that's what we've got to do as as leaders, is recognize that, talk about that, but we don't need to self-flagellate. We're just humans, and that's just being a person. And so, and we saw this this past week, Uber's diversity chief got put on suspension or on leave because in Uber's ongoing training about diversity, she did a couple sessions diving into the spectrum of the American white woman's experience, and basically calling white women Karen was derogatory. Okay, I can't argue with that. I've never heard anybody call somebody Karen in a positive light, right? And so, but then some group of employees on Slack at Uber started blowing up that this was They were being lectured on the difficulties experienced by white women, and that it was dismissive of these other groups' concerns. And so we're getting back into this, who's the most oppressed and all of this. And too often, I think companies whether it's Twitter or your own internal Slack, you're responding as an organization to a small percentage of vocal people. And I think that's a giant mistake. And here's the other thing. This woman wasn't what we would normally categorize as a white lady. I mean, she's Asian. Appears, and I think race is stupid anyway, but she appears to be an Asian. and that's her last name appears Asian. So I just think responding to that is dumb.
I step back from that even to say, why are we talking about that at Uber? I mean, like, why? What's the business reason to be talking about that? Okay, might you have a customer who's a Karen and you need to know how to deal with that? But this is where I kind of, when our workplaces, it's one thing to educate people, right? And to have conversations. But I'm just wondering, like, why was that necessary as a training?
And I think you're right. I totally think you're right. But I would apply it to almost all of the focus on dumb phenotypic traits, right? I mean, skin color, race, background, whatever you want to call it. What we ought to have is a policy that say, hey, we don't talk derogatorily about one another. We're here to work as a team, and we don't, there's certain behaviors that are unacceptable. And that's the system that we're building. And we treat each other with respect and things, and we don't call people names. That's all we have to say. And then we manage to that. I don't think having, but she's hoisted on her own petard because, this was her, this was her initiative and this is what she's supposed to be doing for Uber. But then some folks who, they didn't give us enough in the Wall Street Journal story, information about the demographics of the people who were complaining about it, but clearly they had something other than white women who could be called Karens. They start to throw a fit and object to it, and then we're putting people on leave. It's ridiculous because I definitely think we need respectful workplaces. We need workplaces where people can show up and do their job, feel like they are part of the team, that they're valued for their contributions, and then go home and do whatever they want to. But while you're here, the job is get along with other people and treat other people with respect. I think this focus on changing hearts and minds, and I've said it before here, but when I was growing up in corporate America in the early 90s, we knew we had people who worked around us who were gay, but we didn't ever talk about it. And then it became more and more open. And then more and more people looked at the person in the cubicle next to them and said, oh, he's a good guy. Or I like working with her and she happens to be gay. It's not a big deal. And I think the more we just bring people into the organizations who are otherwise fully competent, who happen to be different than the rest of the demographic, and we don't make a giant deal of it, they just people realize, oh, this and this, it changes how we think about these, whatever our stupid biases are.
Right. And I think you made a good point. I have found that the organizations that are most successful in this area base everything on respect, creating a respectful workplace. So if you're basing it on respect, then those comments, whether they're about how you dress, how you speak, what your color is, what your, abilities, disabilities, if you're pregnant, non-pregnant, whatever, it all takes care of itself. I've always said that. If we can but really believe it, like really walk the talk. We have a respectful workplace. And occasionally you've got to redefine that, right? Because you come up with some bathroom issues, or you come up with some issues that you didn't think about by having, just like, having mothers who need to nurse. Well, now we need to have a place for that. until it comes up, you don't think about it, but we step back and say, what's the respectful thing to do? How are we going to do this? And if you base all that, all this other stuff seems to take care of itself, I think.
And none of it, that is to say that if we see that, we know that in the market, 20% of our market are, for engineers are some class that we're really underrepresented in our workforce, then we need to look at that primarily because there's an ROI on that, right? We need to bring in the best talent. And if we see that we're not bringing in, through whatever, demographics you measured against, fully competent workforce, or for not for the sake of diversity, but a diverse workforce that represents the talent pool that's out there that we can actually benefit from, then we're hurting the business. And I think if we keep going back to the business reason for it, we will look at how we're recruiting and how we're selecting employees and do everything we can to get the most competent in, regardless of whatever those other demographic issues are.
Absolutely.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, premium background checks with fast and friendly service. I helped a client write their first internet and social media policy before Facebook even existed. You remember MySpace? And for years, I've encouraged employers to be very careful in how they use social media in screening candidates, especially when it comes to exposing hiring decision makers to protected class information or other info that simply isn't related to the job. And, like other screening companies, we've helped our clients by providing social and internet media searches on candidates. But we work with each client to identify their specific concerns, the actual online behaviors that they want us to watch for, and then create a profile that is unique to that client, or even unique to that specific job. For instance, beyond normal concerns about violence, drugs, or illegal activity, a company in the beef industry may have specific concerns about applicants who are actively involved in more radical animal welfare organizations. Because it would be literally impossible to effectively search all the social media platforms and the whole internet by hand, we use AI bots to search for keywords and sentiments. And while that's helpful, the process isn't perfect. For instance, a post where a candidate says, "I'm killing it at work," might get flagged by the AI as an indication of violence. Because we don't believe we should expect our clients to separate the wheat from the chaff, my team of trained analysts review the context and apparent intent of each and every result returned by the bots. And then we deliver only the information that is relevant to our clients' stated concerns. If you'd like to discuss social media or any other aspect of your background screening process, reach out to us at imperativeinfo.com. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 3/4 of a recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Research Credits. Then select episode 97 and enter the keyword HR News. That's HRNEWS, no spaces. And now back to my conversation with Terri Swain. The other thing that got my attention for some unknown reason is that a bunch of strippers in Los Angeles joined a union and unionized. And after about a year and a half, they came to an agreement. What I thought was interesting, the strippers, they joined, of all things, the Actors Equity Association. And so, that's about right? It's they're acting like they're glad to see you when you walk in the door. They're probably the best actresses and actors out there. So
maybe,
yeah. Okay, this is going to be one Mike's going to have to carry because Terry's not going to touch it. So.
Yeah, the whole unionization is just an interesting phenomenon to me. As we know in our long HR career, when people are looking at unionizing, it's because there's something systemic within the organization. When you see I think Starbucks is a good example, just because it used to be, if you went to work for Starbucks, like, it was great. you were an entry level and you got college paid for. And somewhere along the lines, Starbucks wasn't so great anymore to work at. I don't know why. Well, I'm sure it's changes in the leadership or culture or whatever it can be. And now unionization is the way to, like, right? So,
Well, yeah. And I mean, generally, I think the companies that get unions deserve them. Uh, I think when you go back and look retrospectively, 3 to 5 years later, they haven't really brought about the change they promised employees when they came in the door. And like Starbucks has been an issue because I mean they were actively salting the union was actively they were sending people in, and I'm sorry, this is what salts do to create discontent. And some of the folks, they've documented how much some of these folks were paid over $100,000 a year to go in and organize and start up in some of these Starbucks. But I don't have any doubt that there's days where it sucks to work at a Starbucks someplace. I mean, that's
right.
and generally, the like I said, the companies that aren't responding, aren't paying attention to what their employees' circumstances are, what the work life is, they are going to, they're the ones who are going to, either those employees are going to talk to a plaintiff's lawyer or they're going to respond to union outreach or something else. And we need to pay attention. Now, back to the important part, the strippers, they unionize primarily.
What was their beef?
Well,
what was their beef?
Yeah, primarily around safety concerns. And I can imagine, I mean, I definitely don't disparage sex work, but I mean, I think anytime you're in sex work, there are going to be safety concerns, and perhaps at this particular strip club, there was an unusual amount of it, and they just wanted better working conditions, and I can't blame them, for wanting that. But here's the quote that after that, I just love. I am looking forward to working with the club owners to rebuild Star Garden into a thriving, inclusive business with a healthy work environment that serves the community, said Velveeta, a Star Garden stripper. So her stage name is Velveeta. I don't even want to know where that name came from. I'm guessing it's olfactory, but I don't know. But and that's of course the only reason we're really talking about this right now is because her name was Velveeta. But I think that's she, this is probably something that was scripted for her by the union because it talks about really unique things, thriving, inclusive business. This is not how people talk about strip clubs with a healthy work environment. But if our employees can say they don't feel like they have a thriving, inclusive work environment and a safe work environment, a healthy work environment, then maybe that does tell us we need to look at making some changes before the union or plaintiff's lawyers come knocking on the door.
Absolutely.
The other big topic continues to be AI. Have you played with it at all?
Yes.
What are you doing with it?
It's pretty amazing. Job descriptions.
Yeah.
Job descriptions are great. I mean, because it's a great starting point. It grabs a lot of things.
I did it. A client who I wasn't doing HR consulting for, but just reached out and said, "Do you have an up-to-date employee handbook that you might give us as a starting point?" And I didn't because I wrote my last handbook 20 years ago and I'm never doing it again. But I jumped on ChatGPT and I've gotten pretty good with the prompts. And so prompted it several different ways and came up with a great outline for an employee handbook, and double check. There were some things that I knew on its face were wrong. It hallucinated that Texas required workers' comp. And I challenged it on that and it apologized, which was cool. Very polite. And, but yeah, so it does that. Or if I get if I see something and I'm curious about a law someplace or where has this been litigated, actually Bard, I found that Google's Bard is better than ChatGPT, pointing you towards specific civil cases around different topics. But Inc. magazine ran an article on how AI is being used in HR, and job descriptions are one of the things. But a lot of them are companies are using chat bots, and there are companies you can go out there and they will sell you the software that will read your internal website for your benefits, and you can feed it your benefits and whatever else you want to feed it, and then sets up a chat bot inside of your intranet or inside your organization, and your employees can go, ask questions about it. It can be used in recruitment, facing the outside world, but it just helps, with those frees up HR pros from routine questions. If somebody's picking up the phone right now and calling HR and saying, I need to change my beneficiary on my benefits, where do I get that form? And somebody in HR has to go look it up, figure out where that form is, and send a chatbot can just deliver that form to them, or just give them the link to it. So I think there's a lot of benefit to it, but there's a lot of chatter. I talk about the Evil HR Lady Facebook group quite a bit. And there are some folks who are really adamant that, no, I'm not going to use it. It's going to put HR people out of work. And I refuse to use, and I'm sorry, you're not going to lose your job to AI. You're going to lose your job to somebody using AI, and to, somebody's going to learn to be more efficient. But we do need to be careful, right? Not to put a bunch of company information. If you're using ChatGPT or Google's Bard, and you start putting in company specific information or PII or anything like that, you're providing that information to somebody outside your company. So I think we need to pay attention to the confidentiality.
But doesn't this remind you of the internet?
Oh yeah, right. Yeah.
When the internet came out, and it's the same thing, right? It was new technology. There was a lot of dangers to using it. I mean, can you believe we used to make people come into a physical place and write out an employment application?
Right.
And I remember the resistance to people doing that you have to do, that, doing their online and then searching through, and there's pluses and minuses always, right? To new ways of doing things. And when we enter into it at first, we don't know the dangers, and then we learn the dangers, and then we go on from there. But I'm also reminded, do you remember at one time, Fort Worth HR, somebody did a presentation, I think it was the professor from UTA that was talking about the future of work, and how he was talking about the high school kids, the jobs they're going to have not even been invented yet. And I think about that because I just had a client tell me that the hottest job right now is a prompt engineer.
Yeah.
They make $280,000 a year, and they're hard to find, but they're programming all these things. So,
but I think it's interesting because I had lunch with a young guy who's a lot smarter than me on all this stuff this weekend, and he's doing amazing stuff on AI, and he thinks this whole prompt engineering thing is going to be, it's a flash in the pan, because everybody's going to have those skills very soon. It's going to be like, how do I use my iPhone? It's going to be that common. And people, how to talk to AI as it gets easier and easier and smarter, nobody's going to need these prompt engineers. And so I think it's kind of like running out and hiring diversity and inclusion experts. We're responding to what we see as a crisis right now. It's the hot thing at the forefront. But I think it's if anything, how to, somebody who can come along, and this should be somebody, let's be honest, somebody in HR who's, paying attention to this stuff and saying, okay, how do we use AI in our organization so that it doesn't create disparate impact and doesn't reinforce some of the dumb things that we don't even recognize that are going on in the organization. And so on that topic, the EEOC came out with guidance on not guidance, a technical advisory or whatever they call it, on employers' use of AI. What was your take on what they said?
Well, I think what they're saying is just what's always been regulation, right? If you have a company that comes in and says, hey, we can find candidates for you, and this has been validated, that you just don't take that at face value. Going back to our DEI discussion, systems, processes in place, to make sure that the whatever you're using, whatever tool you're using for how you find people is validated. And the only way you validate it is running adverse impact analyses, which you should be doing anyway, no matter what method you use to do it. So I think the EEOC was just trying to be like proactive, reminding everybody, hey, if you're using this, make sure, because it's just like testing. There's all those testing companies that'll come out and they'll tell you, oh, our test is valid. It's not going to discriminate. But if you're using it and it is knocking people out at a certain point, then it might not be valid.
Right.
And I went through a OFCCP compliance review once where we had to go back to that company and say, hey, you said this was valid. This is knocking out African Americans at a higher rate. And they said, oh, you're not using that as a knockout factor, are you? You should be using that as one piece of information.
Right.
Hello. So,
and just because something is validated when they're doing a study across a big group doesn't mean how your organization is implementing it. And and so we see it with behavioral assessments all the time. All the assessment companies say, yeah, we've been validated. But that doesn't mean that my choice of this behavioral set for this job is valid in our organization. Right.
Right.
And that's the problem.
And it's the same thing with this tool. It's like anything else. You've got to be smart about it. You can't just say, oh, that's the new shiny penny, just like DEI. That's the new shiny penny. I need to get that penny. How am I going to use it? How am I going to validate it? Is this really working? Are we getting good candidates? Are we getting diverse candidates? Why am I getting all young people and I'm not getting older people? Why am I getting all, whatever the case may be, looking at those things? So it doesn't surprise me. They came out with it that quickly.
Well, this EEOC chair talks about AI a lot and seems really focused and active on disparate impact issues, and it talks about, and so I think the commission is being responsive to, and if our friend Rodney Klein, who's now retired from the EEOC and is doing EEO training. He's being a lot more open about his experiences at EEOC and how reactive so much of their initiatives were to just one commissioner or one chair's pet projects. And so I think that's probably what drove it to jump out there so quickly.
Well, not only that, the EEOC during the Trump years was really investing in technology. So they have a lot of technology resources on staff now. So I'm sure it's more front and center. When they weren't doing a lot of enforcement, they were doing a lot of upgrades to their technology. So they've got more technology people on staff. So I'm sure it's front and center.
And this week, there was also stories about using not just AI in employee selection, but also in employee monitoring. So we've got all these remote employees and we're trying to figure out, okay, are they working or not? So we're monitoring keystrokes and things like that. But hey, Jane was away, 4 times, we have one 15-minute scheduled break in the day or whatever. And Jane was gone, didn't do any keystrokes for four times for, some period of time each time. And again, the EEOC chair was out there talking about it and saying, if this was in the workplace, you would happen to know that Jane was a breastfeeding mother who needed to go do whatever that's called, and express. That's the word. Yeah, yeah. But remote, you don't know that. So just taking automatic action against Jane could create a violation there.
Yeah, and that whole work from home. I mean, the work from home, going back to the workplace, I think that's really causing so much distress right now in the workplace. I see that as it's just an interesting issue, right? It's so interesting because we trusted you to do this when it was in our best interest.
Right.
And now we want you back. We want you back. And people are questioning, why do you want me back? And then you look at some of the productivity statistics that have come out that as a nation, our productivity has dipped. Is that related? I don't know. So, Yeah, the whole AI thing and monitoring employees, that I would never want to work somewhere where somebody didn't trust me
Right.
to do my job.
Well, I mean,
Right?
I think, on episode number 2, back in August of 2021, you and I talked about how the pandemic had exposed the good and the bad managers. And
Right.
I'd said when we first went remote that the organizations that managed, by, KPIs and performance and had good measures of quality and productivity, they were going to be okay. But the organizations that managed by looking over people's shoulders, what are you working on, and walking, manage that whole management by walking around, which there's some value to having access to your employees and know what's going on and all of that. But if that's your primary management tool, you're screwed when you go remote. It probably wasn't great for your management style when you were in person either. I mean, nobody likes having their boss look over their shoulder and asking them those questions. But I think this whole remote thing, we've seen things where people have you know, their camera takes a picture every, 5 minutes of them sitting at their desk. I mean, and maybe does a screenshot of whatever they're looking at that time. If you've got to do that, you've got some bigger issues that you need to
Right.
address than that one employee who's whether it's doing whatever that may get you in trouble for even trying to address it. But again, if you've got an organization where people can communicate, and if the chances are highly unlikely, but if I were a young mother and I had to express and share something with my boss that, hey, I got to go do this on a few times a day. If you had if you have a relationship, you have that openness in your organization where you can do that, then you're fine. If you're afraid that you're going to be penalized because of it, then that's how employers get into this trouble, because they don't have they don't have an open communication with their employees.
Agree.
And last but not least, just real quick, there was a CNBC article about American CEOs are failing their workers right now. We're in a crisis of trust, which kind of ties in with what we were just talking about. And we're going to have links to all these stories, but uh, do you think the trust has changed, or do you think the employees' expectations have changed? Are companies less trustworthy, or what's your take on that?
Well, my take on that is I do think the whole being remote, and now CEOs wanting people back and the reasons that they want them, I think that's causing distress. I also think the whole economic, how much my CEO is making, so all that transparency about, the CEO makes 15 times more than I do. So I think there's more disparity in compensation that leads to that whole, I don't know, it's almost like and then I'm talking about really big
Right.
companies, I guess, mostly, I think, that they feel so untouchable in a way,
Well,
right?
and I think most people trust or distrust their company not because of the CEO, it's because of their own leadership.
Well, yeah,
And I mean,
that's
their
true.
experience with their own manager. And again, we hire people to do a certain kind of job, they excel at it, and then we make them a manager of people and assume that they could do that. It's a completely different skill set. And I was talking to a client not long ago, and the person they wanted to put into a supervision role wasn't their strongest performer in that work unit, but was the one who could motivate and lead people. And they were really nervous about how it was going to be taken by by the person who really wanted the job, but was horrible with people. And I said, well, you got two choices. Either you should probably train that person to be better with people either way, and give them that skill set. But if this is the best leader you've got, they don't have to be the best technical person. And those are two different skill sets, but we don't do that too often. And I've just got to put in that CEO pay doesn't bother me like it does so many other people. There are precious few people who could be a successful CEO for Ford Motor Company. And there are a lot of people who could be accountants for Ford Motor Company. And so or turn a screwdriver for Ford or whatever. And the market drives what those people are paid. And so, and if a board said, we're not going to pay this person that, then they're taking the risk that if they really think this is the person best qualified to lead the organization through a certain period, that they're not going to get them. And so I don't think it's greed. I don't think it's just welcome to market forces.
Right.
Now, does that mean that we shouldn't give our employees livable wages and opportunities for growth and all that? No, we definitely we should. That's good business as well.
Yeah, but I think the average person sees that and they don't understand all that.
Oh, I agree.
It's not explained, and they see, American Airlines, I'm just using as an example, our customers are upset with us. We've got labor problems and you're getting X, and I don't even know if that's true about American Airlines. I'm just saying, for example, I think the average person, and
say
that
Braniff.
may be why
Braniff is a safe one. Yeah.
Braniff. There you go. Yeah. Cause Americans in our backyard, we love American Airlines.
Keep paying taxes to Fort Worth, please, America. Yeah.
But, so I don't know.
Well, we have exhausted all our time today, and probably our listeners too.
Aww.
Thanks for joining me again, Terri.
Thank you, Mike.
And thank you for listening. You can comment on this episode, tell me where I'm right, I don't want to hear where I'm wrong, or search our previous episodes at goodmorninghr.com or on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcast. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and you can reach him at robmakespods.com. And thank you to Imperative's marketing coordinator, Marianne Hernandez, who keeps the trains running on time. And I'm Mike Coffey. As always, please don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.